The morning mist clung to the perfectly manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates like a shroud hiding secrets, and as I stood at my kitchen window sipping coffee from my favorite ceramic mug, I had no idea that my entire world was about to crumble. The scent of jasmine drifted through my open window, mixing with the rich aroma of dark roast, creating what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning ritual. Instead, my hands trembled slightly as I watched my neighbor Patricia Hendricks march up the stone walkway to the community center, a thick manila folder clutched against her chest like armor. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, ever since my divorce, and I thought I knew these tree-lined streets like the back of my hand. The distinctive red brick facades, the uniform emerald lawns, the subtle competition over who had the most pristine flower beds. It had become my sanctuary. But something in Patricia's purposeful stride, the way her designer heels clicked against the pavement with military precision, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the screen. Before I tell you this incredible story, please hit like and subscribe. I'd love to know in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Margaret King. I'm 56 years old, and what I discovered that morning would shake the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about trust, friendship, and the place I called home. The ceramic tile under my bare feet felt suddenly cold as I pressed closer to the window, watching Patricia disappear into the building where our monthly homeowners association meetings were held. But this wasn't a meeting day. This was something else entirely. Patricia Hendricks had been my neighbor for 8 years, ever since she'd moved into the sprawling colonial directly across from my modest but well-maintained 2-story. At 62, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from old money and newer power. Her silver hair always perfectly styled in a bob that never seemed to move even in strong wind. She served as the self-appointed liaison between residents and the HOA board, a position she'd created for herself and defended with the ferocity of a guard dog protecting territory. Her house was a testament to her personality, imposing, flawless, and somehow intimidating even in broad daylight. Every shutter was painted the exact shade of forest green, every flower bed maintained by professional landscapers who arrived like clockwork every Tuesday at precisely 9 a.m. The sound of footsteps on my stairs interrupted my surveillance, and I turned to see my daughter Sarah King descending, her curly brown hair still tousled from sleep. At 28, she'd inherited my stubborn streak, but thankfully her father's patience, and she'd been staying with me for the past month while transitioning between jobs. Her presence had been a blessing. Someone to share morning coffee with, someone to remind me that family meant more than neighborhood politics. "Mom, you're doing that thing again," Sarah said, padding into the kitchen in her worn college sweatshirt and fuzzy slippers. The familiar scent of her vanilla body lotion mixed with the morning air as she reached for a mug from the cabinet. The thing where you stare out the window like you're planning a military strategy. I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Just watching the neighborhood wake up. Patricia's at the community center awfully early for a Saturday, don't you think?" Sarah joined me at the window, her warm presence comforting against my shoulder. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the morning joggers make their rounds past the ornate street lamps and carefully pruned oak trees that gave our development its name. The sound of a lawnmower started up somewhere in the distance, joining the symphony of suburban Saturday morning sounds. "You know what your problem is, Mom?" Sarah said, taking a sip of coffee and making that face she always made when it was too hot. "You care too much about what these people think. Half of them have nothing better to do than worry about whether Mrs. Henderson's rose bushes are 2 inches taller than regulation height." If only it were that simple. The truth was, I'd grown to love this community despite its quirks and petty dramas. After my divorce 12 years ago, Oakwood Estates had represented stability, respectability, a fresh start where I could rebuild my life on my own terms. I'd thrown myself into community involvement, volunteering for the neighborhood watch, organizing the annual block party, even serving on the architectural review committee for 3 years. These weren't just neighbors. They were supposed to be my support system. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts, and I smiled when I saw the caller ID. "Morning, Helen," I answered, grateful for the distraction. "Margaret, honey, I hope I'm not calling too early." Helen Morrison's voice carried that slight rasp that came from 67 years of living and a decades-old smoking habit she'd finally kicked. Helen lived 4 houses down in a charming Cape Cod-style home, painted soft yellow with white trim, and she'd been my closest friend in the neighborhood since my second week here when she'd shown up at my door with homemade banana bread and an offer to help me figure out the garbage pickup schedule. Helen was everything Patricia wasn't. Warm where Patricia was cold, inclusive where Patricia was exclusive, genuine where Patricia was calculating. Her house reflected her personality too, with its wildflower garden that violated at least 3 HOA guidelines and her collection of garden gnomes that had sparked a 6-month battle with the architectural committee. Helen had won that battle through sheer persistence and the discovery of a loophole in the decorative objects clause. "Not too early at all," I assured her, settling into one of my kitchen chairs while Sarah busied herself making toast. "What's going on?" "That's what I was hoping to ask you." Helen's voice carried a note of concern that immediately put me on alert. "I just got back from my morning walk, and I saw Patricia heading into the community center with what looked like enough paperwork to file taxes for a small corporation. She was moving like a woman on a mission, if you know what I mean." The knot in my stomach tightened. Helen had always been observant, a quality that came from years of working as a librarian before her retirement. She noticed details that others missed, patterns that others overlooked. If she was concerned enough to call, there was definitely something to worry about. "I saw that too," I admitted, watching through the window as more neighbors began their Saturday routines. Mr. Chen was retrieving his newspaper from the end of his driveway, careful to avoid stepping on the grass that he maintained with scientific precision. The Williams family was loading their SUV for what looked like a soccer game, their youngest daughter already in her bright blue uniform. "Margaret," Helen said, and something in her tone made me grip the phone tighter. "I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure how to say it." Sarah looked up from buttering her toast, catching the tension in my voice. I gestured for her to sit down, suddenly needing her calming presence nearby. "Just say it, Helen. We've been friends too long for dancing around difficult topics." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of Helen's breathing and the distant hum of neighborhood activity. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a physical blow. "Yesterday afternoon, I was working in my front garden when Patricia walked by with that new resident from Maple Street. You know, the woman with the white BMW who moved in last month. They didn't see me behind the rose trellis, and I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Patricia was telling her about the problem properties in the neighborhood, the ones that were supposedly bringing down everyone's property values." My mouth went dry. "And?" "Oh, honey." Helen's voice was soft with sympathy. "Your house was at the top of her list. She was going on and on about your garden decorations, your paint color choices, even the fact that Sarah's been staying with you. She made it sound like you were single-handedly destroying the character of Oakwood Estates." The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, clattering against the kitchen table and sending dark liquid spreading across the oak surface. Sarah immediately jumped up to grab paper towels, but I barely noticed the mess. My mind was reeling, trying to process what Helen had just told me. She specifically mentioned property values? I managed to ask. Multiple times. And Margaret, she was taking notes, writing down addresses, talking about presenting evidence to the HOA board. She made it sound like she was building some kind of case. The room felt like it was tilting slightly, the familiar comfort of my kitchen suddenly foreign and unstable. I looked around at the space I'd carefully decorated over the years. The herb garden visible through the back door, the cheerful yellow paint I'd chosen to brighten the rooms, the family photos clustered on the refrigerator. Everything that made this house feel like home was apparently under attack. Sarah finished cleaning up the spilled coffee and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Mom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I covered the phone's mouthpiece and whispered, "Patricia's been telling people our house is bringing down property values." The words tasted bitter in my mouth, like betrayal served with morning coffee. "That's ridiculous," Sarah said immediately, her voice rising with indignation. "This house is beautiful. You've put so much work into making it perfect." But even as my daughter defended our home, doubts began creeping in. Was my garden too casual compared to the professionally maintained landscapes around me? Had I violated some unwritten rule about paint colors when I'd touched up the trim last spring? Was Sarah's extended stay somehow against HOA regulations I wasn't aware of? "Helen, are you still there?" I asked. "I'm here, honey, and I want you to know that what Patricia was saying was complete nonsense. Your house is lovely, and you've been nothing but a wonderful neighbor. But I thought you should know what she's been saying behind your back." I thanked Helen and hung up, my mind racing with questions and fears. For 12 years, I'd tried to be the perfect neighbor, following every rule, participating in every community event, maintaining my property to the highest standards. I'd believed that Patricia and I, if not close friends, were at least respectful acquaintances. We'd served on committees together, exchanged pleasantries during morning walks, even shared the occasional conversation about property maintenance and neighborhood concerns. But apparently, while I'd been living my life and trying to be a good neighbor, Patricia had been watching, judging, and building a case against me. The manila folder she'd carried into the community center this morning suddenly took on a sinister significance. What kind of evidence could she possibly have gathered? What had I done wrong without realizing it? Sarah sat down across from me, her expression serious. "Mom, talk to me. What exactly did Helen say?" I filled her in on the conversation, watching my daughter's face grow more incredulous with each detail. By the time I finished, Sarah was shaking her head in disbelief. "This is insane," she said. "You've lived here for over a decade. You know everyone's kids' names. You organize the block party every year. You've never had so much as a noise complaint. How could anyone think you're bringing down property values?" That was exactly what I intended to find out. I stood up from the table, my resolve strengthening with each passing moment. If Patricia Hendricks wanted to make me a target, she was going to have to face me directly instead of skulking around, spreading rumors and building secret cases. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked as I headed toward the stairs. "To get dressed," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If Patricia wants to discuss my impact on neighborhood property values, then we're going to have that discussion, face to face." But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my confidence wavered slightly. The morning light streaming through the landing window seemed harsh suddenly, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny accusations in the air. What if Patricia was right? What if I had been blind to problems that were obvious to everyone else? What if 12 years of trying to belong had somehow made me the neighborhood pariah without me even realizing it? I paused at my bedroom door, looking back down the hallway lined with family photos, and small decorative touches that made this house feel like home. Whatever Patricia thought she had on me, whatever case she was building, I deserved to know about it. I deserved the chance to defend myself and the life I'd built here. And that's when the pattern snapped into place. I changed into my best slacks and a crisp blue blouse, trying to armor myself with confidence. As I brushed my hair, I caught my reflection in the mirror and practiced what I might say to Patricia. "We need to talk," sounded too confrontational. "I heard you had some concerns," felt too passive. Maybe I should just knock on her door and see what came out. Downstairs, Sarah was pacing in the kitchen, her coffee mug forgotten on the counter. "You know what bothers me most about this?" she said as I entered. "Patricia has always seemed so friendly to your face. Remember last month when she brought over those tomatoes from her garden? She stood in our driveway for 20 minutes talking about her grandson's baseball season." "I remember." I grabbed my keys from the bowl by the door. "She seemed genuinely interested when I told her about your promotion at work." "Exactly, and the whole time she was probably taking mental notes about something. What could it possibly be, Mom? Your grass is perfect, your house is immaculate. You don't even play music loud enough for anyone to hear." Before I could answer, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Sarah and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see Patricia's distinctive silhouette, her gray hair pulled back in its usual tight bun. "Well," I said, my heart hammering, "I guess I don't have to go to her." I opened the door to find Patricia standing on my porch, still clutching that manila folder. Her face was flushed, and she looked uncharacteristically flustered. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight, "we need to discuss something." "Yes, we do." I stepped back. "Come in." Patricia entered stiffly, nodding curtly at Sarah. "I didn't realize you had company." "Sarah's my daughter," I said. "She can stay." "Actually, this is rather personal." Patricia's knuckles were white as she gripped the folder. "It concerns your impact on the neighborhood." Sarah crossed her arms. "You mean the conversation Helen overheard this morning at the community center?" Patricia's face went pale, then red. "Helen Morrison has a very big mouth." "So you don't deny it?" I asked, finding my voice stronger than expected. "You don't deny telling the homeowners association that I'm bringing down property values?" For a moment, Patricia said nothing. She looked around my living room, taking in the tasteful furniture, the clean surfaces, the family photos arranged on the mantel. Then she sank into my armchair uninvited and opened the folder. "I didn't want it to come to this, Margaret. I really hoped you'd notice and fix things on your own." "Fix what things?" Sarah demanded. "What are you talking about?" Patricia pulled out a sheet of paper covered in her precise handwriting. "I've been documenting incidents for the past 6 months. Would you like me to read them?" The room felt suddenly airless. "Go ahead," I managed to say. Patricia adjusted her reading glasses. "March 15th, garbage cans left at the curb until Thursday evening, a full 2 days after pickup. March 22nd, same issue. April 3rd, loud music and voices in the backyard until nearly 10:30 at night." "That was Sarah's birthday dinner," I interrupted. "We had 6 people over, and we were inside by 10. "The noise carried," Patricia said firmly, making a note. "April 18th, car parked partially blocking the sidewalk for over an hour while unloading what appeared to be furniture." Sarah let out an incredulous laugh. "You're kidding me. You're actually documenting normal life activities?" But Patricia wasn't finished. "May 7th, lawnmower used before 8 a.m. on a Saturday. May 21st, package deliveries left scattered on the porch for most of the day, creating an unsightly appearance." I felt like I was drowning. Each item on her list felt simultaneously ridiculous and somehow damning. Patricia, these are such minor things. Minor things add up, Margaret. They create an impression. She shuffled through more papers. But it's not just the day-to-day issues. It's the bigger picture. What bigger picture? Sarah's voice was rising. Patricia hesitated, then pulled out what looked like printed photographs. Your landscaping choices, for instance. That wildflower garden you planted along the front walkway? What about it? I asked, though my stomach was already sinking. It's not in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic. Everyone else has maintained lawns and structured plantings. Your approach looks... She paused, unkempt. The wildflower garden had been my pride and joy this spring. I'd researched native plants, carefully planned the layout, spent weekends nurturing seedlings. It was beautiful and environmentally responsible. Furthermore, Patricia continued, your choice to repaint your front door that blue color without consulting the architectural review committee was highly irregular. There's no rule about door colors in this neighborhood, Sarah said. There's no written rule, Patricia corrected, but there's an understood standard. I stared at this woman who had eaten dinner at my table, who had borrowed my hedge trimmer, who had hugged me at neighborhood gatherings. Patricia, why didn't you just talk to me about these concerns directly? For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. I tried to drop hints. Hints. When I mentioned how nice Mrs. Chen's traditional roses looked compared to all those wild plants. When I commented on how prompt the Johnsons were about bringing in their garbage cans. The room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I thought back over the past months, trying to remember these conversations, wondering how many other seemingly innocent comments had actually been criticisms. But then Patricia pulled out one more paper, and her expression shifted to something almost triumphant. However, Margaret, there's something else. Something much more serious that I discovered just yesterday. She handed me a document that made my blood run cold. My hands trembled as I looked at the document. It was a copy of a city permit application, one I'd filed 3 weeks ago for the small vegetable garden shed I'd been planning to build in my backyard. You applied for a building permit without going through the homeowners association first? Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made my stomach churn. Sarah leaned over to read the document. Mom, this is just for that little garden shed we talked about building. The HOA bylaws clearly state that any structure, regardless of size, requires association approval before city permits can be obtained. Patricia continued. This is a direct violation of our covenants. I felt the walls closing in. The shed was supposed to be my summer project with Sarah, something we'd been excited about planning together. It was going to be small, tasteful, tucked discreetly behind the existing privacy fence. Patricia, I honestly didn't know about that rule, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ignorance of the bylaws isn't an excuse, Margaret. Every homeowner received a copy when they moved in. That was 8 years ago. The thick packet of legal documents had been overwhelming then, filed away, and largely forgotten as life took over. Moving in as a newly divorced single mother, I'd been more concerned with getting Sarah settled in a good school district than parsing through homeowner association fine print. Sarah's face was flushed with anger. This is insane, Patricia. You're treating my mom like she's some kind of criminal over a garden shed. But Patricia wasn't done. She reached for yet another folder, and I wondered how long she'd been building this case against me. There's also the matter of your vehicle situation. My vehicle situation? I echoed. Your car has been leaking oil in your driveway. I have photographs documenting the stains over the past month. I thought about my 12-year-old Honda, which had indeed developed a small leak I'd been meaning to get fixed. Between work, Sarah's activities, and managing the household, car maintenance had slipped down my priority list. I was planning to take it to the shop this weekend, I said weakly. The damage to the concrete is already done. Oil stains are permanent and unsightly. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You know what's unsightly, Patricia? This whole conversation. You're sitting here attacking my mother with a stack of papers like she's your enemy instead of your friend. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm documenting legitimate concerns that affect all of us. No, you're being a bully, Sarah shot back. And you're doing it behind our backs instead of having an honest conversation? I watched this exchange, feeling both grateful for Sarah's fierce loyalty and horrified that my daughter was having to defend me against someone who used to be a close friend. The relationship between Sarah and Patricia had always been warm. Patricia had watched Sarah grow up, had given her advice about everything from school projects to college applications. Sarah, please, I said softly. Let's try to work this out. But Patricia was gathering her papers with sharp, efficient movements. I think we've covered everything I came to discuss. The HOA meeting is Thursday at 7. I trust you'll be there to address these issues. The formal tone cut deep. This was the same woman who had cried on my shoulder when her husband left, who had helped me refinish Sarah's bedroom furniture, who had been part of countless casual dinners and shared confidences. Patricia, I tried one more time. Can't we talk about this as friends? Find solutions that work for everyone? She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret flicker across her face. This isn't personal, Margaret. It's about maintaining standards that protect everyone's investment. After she left, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence. The kitchen suddenly felt too large and too small at the same time. Mom, Sarah finally said, we need to call someone. This isn't right. But before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar and unexpected. I answered the phone with a shaky hello, still processing Patricia's visit and the stack of complaints she'd left behind. Margaret, it's Tom, from next door. Sarah looked at me with raised eyebrows. Tom rarely called, preferring to chat over the fence or wave from his driveway. His voice sounded different too, more serious than his usual cheerful tone. Hi, Tom. Is everything okay? Well, that's what I'm calling about. I saw Patricia leaving your place, and she didn't look happy. Look, I need to tell you something, and I probably should have said it sooner. I put the phone on speaker so Sarah could hear. What is it? Tom cleared his throat uncomfortably. Patricia's been coming by my house asking questions about you. Started maybe 6 weeks ago. Casual at first, you know? Just wondering if your car was leaking oil, if I'd noticed any issues with your yard maintenance, that sort of thing. My stomach dropped. 6 weeks. This had been building for much longer than I'd realized. At first, I figured she was just making conversation, but then she started taking pictures of your driveway, your lawn, even your garbage cans on collection day. When I asked her about it, she said she was documenting neighborhood standards. Sarah's face darkened. She's been stalking us for 6 weeks? I should have told you sooner, Tom continued. But honestly, I thought it would blow over. Patricia's always been particular about the neighborhood, but this feels different, more intense. I sank into my chair, the weight of betrayal settling deeper. Did she say why she was doing this? She mentioned something about protecting property values, but Margaret, I've lived here for 15 years. Your house has always been well maintained. Sure, maybe the lawn could use a touch-up here and there, but nothing that would actually affect anyone's home value. The validation felt like a lifeline, but it also made Patricia's behavior even more confusing. "Tom, do you have any idea what really triggered this?" There was a long pause. "I hate to speculate, but the timing seems to coincide with when the Hendersons put their house up for sale. You know how Patricia gets when she thinks the neighborhood image is at stake." Sarah leaned toward the phone. "So she decided to target Mom as a scapegoat?" "I don't know about that," Tom said carefully. "But I do know she's been more on edge lately. More critical of everyone, actually. She made some comments about my garden borders last week that seemed pretty nitpicky." This revelation shifted something in my understanding. Maybe this wasn't entirely personal after all. Maybe Patricia was struggling with something bigger than my oil stain. "Tom, what do you think I should do about the HOA meeting?" "Go. Definitely go. But don't go alone, and don't go unprepared. Patricia's organized, and she's passionate about this. You need to be ready to present your side calmly and factually." After we hung up, Sarah immediately started pacing around the kitchen. "Mom, this is crazy. She's been documenting our lives like we're criminals. That's not normal neighbor behavior." "No, it's not." I picked up Patricia's complaint list, scanning through the items with fresh eyes. "But Tom's right about one thing. I need to address these issues before Thursday." "You're actually going to play along with this?" "I'm going to take care of the legitimate problems," I clarified. "The car does need to be fixed, and I have been putting off some yard work. But I'm also going to stand up for myself." Sarah stopped pacing and looked at me intently. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Patricia used to be my friend, and friends don't ambush each other with formal complaints and photograph evidence. If she had concerns, she should have talked to me directly first." The more I thought about it, the more my initial hurt began transforming into something else. Not anger exactly, but a clearer sense of what was fair and what wasn't. "I'm going to that meeting," I continued, "but not to grovel or make excuses. I'm going to present solutions for the actual issues and address the way this whole situation was handled." Sarah smiled for the first time since Patricia had arrived. "Good, because watching you get ambushed like that was horrible." Over the next hour, we made a plan. I would get the car to the shop first thing in the morning, tackle the yard work over the weekend, and prepare a response for the HOA meeting that was both reasonable and self-respecting. But as we worked through the logistics, one question kept nagging at me. Patricia's behavior was so out of character for the woman I'd known for years. Something else had to be driving this crusade. I was still puzzling over it when my phone rang again. This time, Patricia's name appeared on the caller ID. I stared at Patricia's name on my phone screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Sarah noticed my hesitation and moved closer. "Is that her?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, still frozen. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. I swiped to answer. "Hello, Patricia." "Margaret." Her voice sounded different than it had earlier. Less confident, maybe even shaky. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's fine." I kept my tone neutral, waiting to see where this conversation would go. There was a long pause before Patricia spoke again. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation today, about the HOA meeting." "What about it?" "Well, I was thinking that maybe we could resolve some of these issues before Thursday. You know, neighbor to neighbor, without having to involve the whole association." I felt my eyebrows rise. This was definitely not the Patricia who had stood on my doorstep 3 hours ago, with her folder of complaints and photographic evidence. "That's interesting, Patricia, because when we talked earlier, you seemed pretty committed to the formal process." Sarah was watching me intently, clearly trying to follow both sides of the conversation from my responses. "Yes, well," Patricia cleared her throat. I may have been a bit hasty. I've been under a lot of pressure lately, and I suppose I got carried away. Now we were getting somewhere. What kind of pressure? Another long pause. The HOA board has been on my case about enforcement. They appointed me to the compliance committee last month, and they've made it clear that they expect results. They want to see property values maintained, and they've been very explicit about holding me accountable for that. I sank down onto one of the kitchen chairs, pieces finally clicking into place. So this isn't really about my oil stain. It started with legitimate concerns, Patricia said quickly. The car situation, the yard maintenance. But you're right that I should have talked to you first, the way I always have before. Yes, you should have. I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I know. I'm sorry about that. It's just that the board specifically mentioned your property as one they wanted me to address. They said if I couldn't handle the easier cases on my own street, maybe I wasn't the right person for the position. Sarah had positioned herself where she could hear better, her expression shifting from anger to something more like understanding. Patricia, how long have we been neighbors? I asked. 8 years in October. And in those 8 years, when you've had concerns about something I was doing, how have we handled it? I've always just talked to you directly, she admitted quietly. Exactly. And I've always been reasonable about addressing legitimate issues, haven't I? Yes, you have. I stood up and walked to the window that looked out toward Patricia's house. Her kitchen light was on, and I could see her silhouette moving around. So what changed this time? Really? Patricia sighed deeply. Honestly, I was afraid. The board made it sound like my credibility was on the line. They said if neighbors thought they could just dismiss my concerns with friendly conversation, I'd never be effective at enforcement. But we're not just neighbors, Patricia. At least, I thought we were friends. We are friends. That's why I'm calling. I realized after I got home that I'd handled this all wrong. I let the board pressure me into treating you like a violation instead of talking to you like a person. Sarah caught my eye and nodded approvingly. I could see she was starting to understand that Patricia wasn't necessarily the villain we'd painted her as. I appreciate you calling to explain, I said. But Patricia, the damage is already done. You filed a formal complaint, scheduled a hearing, and frankly, made me feel like I'm under surveillance in my own neighborhood. I know, and I want to make it right. How? Well, I was hoping we could work together to resolve the actual issues, and then I could withdraw the complaint before Thursday. I considered this. It would certainly be easier than going through a formal HOA hearing, but something about it still bothered me. What about the board pressure you mentioned? Won't they just give you grief about backing down? Let me worry about that, Patricia said. I should never have let their expectations override my judgment about how to handle things with you. Sarah was making gestures at me, clearly wanting to weigh in on the conversation. I held up a finger to indicate I needed another moment. Patricia, I'm willing to work with you, but I need some assurances. Such as? First, I need to know that this surveillance and documentation stops immediately. We go back to talking to each other directly if there are concerns. Absolutely. That was never how I wanted to handle things anyway. Second, I want to understand what exactly the board expects from your committee, because I don't want to be blindsided by this kind of thing again. That's fair. I can share the guidelines they gave me. I looked at Sarah, who was nodding encouragingly. The conversation felt more productive than I'd expected, but I still had reservations. There's one more thing, Patricia. I need to trust that you're being completely honest with me about what's driving this. Because if there are other factors at play that you're not telling me about, I'd rather just deal with the formal hearing." The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Patricia spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is one other thing I haven't told you." My heart sank. I'd been hoping Patricia's explanation would clear everything up, but apparently there were more layers to this situation. "What is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. Sarah was watching me intently, clearly picking up on my change in tone. She moved closer, trying to hear Patricia's side of the conversation. "It's about your son, Michael," Patricia said. "Some of his friends have been... well, there have been some incidents that I didn't include in the formal complaint because I wasn't sure how to handle them." I felt my protective instincts flare immediately. "What kind of incidents?" "Last weekend, when he had friends over for his birthday party, there were some issues in the early evening, before the noise complaint I mentioned. A few of his friends were throwing a football in your backyard, which is fine, but the ball kept going over the fence into the Hendersons' yard." "Kids retrieve balls from neighbors' yards all the time, Patricia. That's hardly worth documenting." I know. But here's the thing. Instead of knocking on the door or asking permission, they kept jumping the fence to get it. And when Mrs. Henderson came out to ask them to use the gate instead, they were... well, they weren't exactly respectful." Sarah was making questioning faces at me, so I covered the phone briefly. "She's saying Michael's friends were rude to a neighbor," I whispered. Sarah's expression shifted to concern. Michael was her stepson, but she'd been in his life for 3 years now and cared about him deeply. "Which friends?" she whispered back. I uncovered the phone. "Patricia, what exactly did they say to Mrs. Henderson?" "One of them told her it was faster to just hop the fence and that they'd be done soon. When she explained that it made her uncomfortable to have teenagers jumping into her yard without permission, another one said something about how it was just a yard and she should chill out." I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like something Michael's friend Jake would say. The kid had no filter and even less respect for authority. Did Michael participate in this conversation? That's the thing. He actually tried to get his friends to apologize and use the gate. But they kind of brushed him off, and he didn't push it further. Mrs. Henderson was pretty upset about the whole thing. Sarah was tugging on my sleeve, clearly wanting more details. I held up a finger again. "Patricia, why didn't you just come talk to me about this when it happened?" I thought about it. I really did. But then the board meeting happened on Tuesday. And when I brought up general concerns about property maintenance and neighborhood respect, suddenly everyone was telling me about other issues they'd noticed at your house. The overgrown garden, the late-night music, your car blocking the sidewalk during that dinner party last month. So this complaint isn't really about my behavior at all. It's about Michael's friends and a bunch of other neighbors' pet peeves that they've been collecting instead of talking to me directly. "That's not entirely fair," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your garden really has gotten quite overgrown, and the music that night was pretty loud." I felt my anger building again, but tried to keep my voice level. "Patricia, the garden got overgrown because I've been working 60-hour weeks trying to cover for a colleague who quit unexpectedly. The music was loud one night because we were celebrating Sarah's promotion. And I moved my car the moment someone asked me to." Sarah was gesturing more insistently now, so I covered the phone again. "What is it?" I whispered. "Ask her who Mrs. Henderson is and where she lives," Sarah said quietly. "Because if it's the house with the blue shutters, she complained to me directly about our sprinkler system hitting her driveway. She didn't seem unreasonable at all." I uncovered the phone. "Patricia, we're talking about Mrs. Henderson in the blue house on the corner, right?" "Yes, that's right." She spoke to Sarah directly about a sprinkler issue a few weeks ago, and they worked it out like normal neighbors do. Why didn't she just come talk to me about the football situation? She said she tried to catch you a few times, but your schedules didn't line up. And then when she mentioned it to me, I told her I was planning to address some concerns with you anyway, so she asked me to include it. Sarah shook her head in frustration. So everyone's using Patricia as a middleman instead of just talking to us directly, she said, loud enough for Patricia to hear. Is that Sarah? Patricia asked. Hi, Sarah. I'm sorry you're both caught up in this mess. Sarah gestured for me to put the call on speaker, so I did. Hi, Patricia, Sarah said. I have to say, this whole situation feels really backwards. We've lived here for 3 years, and I thought we had a good relationship with our neighbors. You do, Patricia insisted. That's what makes this so complicated. Nobody has major problems with you two personally. It's more about little things that have been adding up, plus some concerns about whether the standards in the neighborhood are slipping generally. But Patricia, I said, if these are little things, why escalate to a formal HOA complaint instead of just having conversations? Because the board made it clear that the enforcement committee needs to start actually enforcing. They're getting pressure from some homeowners who think the neighborhood is getting too relaxed about standards. Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was starting to sound like neighborhood politics rather than legitimate concerns about our behavior. Patricia, Sarah said, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Do you personally think our behavior is bringing down property values? Or are you being pressured to find violations to justify the enforcement committee's existence? The silence that followed was so long and telling that I thought we might have gotten disconnected again. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice strained. There's something else I haven't told you about the board meeting. What else? I asked, feeling my stomach knot up. Sarah moved closer to me, and I could see the worry in her eyes. Patricia took a deep breath before continuing. The board is implementing something they're calling the Neighborhood Standards Initiative. They want to do quarterly property assessments of every home, and they're starting with houses that have received any complaints in the past year. Wait, Sarah said. So, because Mrs. Henderson mentioned the football thing, we're automatically on some kind of watch list? It's not exactly a watch list, but yes, your property would be among the first to get a formal assessment. They're looking at everything: landscaping maintenance, exterior paint condition, driveway staining, holiday decoration compliance, even things like how often trash cans are visible from the street. I felt a surge of anger. Patricia, this is insane. We take good care of our house, better than most people in the neighborhood. I know you do. That's why I'm telling you this now instead of letting you find out when the assessment notice shows up in your mailbox next week. Sarah grabbed my arm. Next week? They're coming next week? The assessment committee is scheduling visits for the first batch of homes. They'll give you 48 hours notice, and then they'll walk around your property with clipboards and cameras, documenting anything that could be considered a violation. I started pacing around our kitchen, the phone still on speaker. This is harassment, Patricia. Pure and simple harassment. I understand why you feel that way, but from the board's perspective, they're responding to concerns about property values. Apparently, there's been some pressure from a few vocal homeowners who think the HOA hasn't been strict enough. Which homeowners? Sarah asked pointedly. Patricia hesitated. I can't really name names, but let's just say there are people who have very specific ideas about what our neighborhood should look like. People like Derek? I asked, thinking of our most rules-obsessed neighbor. Another long pause. Derek has been very active in recent board meetings. Sarah and I looked at each other with growing understanding. Derek Morrison had moved to the neighborhood about a year ago, and immediately started attending HOA meetings, sending detailed emails about minor infractions he noticed during his daily walks, and generally making himself known as someone who cared deeply about maintaining standards. "So Derek is behind this whole initiative?" Sarah asked. "He's not the only one, but he's been the most vocal advocate for stricter enforcement. He actually volunteered to chair the new assessment committee." My heart sank. Derek was the kind of person who would measure the height of your grass with a ruler and report you for having it a quarter inch too long. The thought of him walking around our property with a clipboard, looking for violations, made me feel sick. "Patricia, this has gotten completely out of hand," I said. "What started as Mrs. Henderson asking about football in the front yard has turned into some kind of neighborhood surveillance program." "I know, and I'm sorry. I never intended for things to escalate like this. But once Derek got involved and started talking about property values and neighborhood reputation, the board felt like they had to take action." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Patricia, what exactly are you asking us to do? Why are you giving us this heads up?" "Because you're good neighbors, and I don't want to see you get caught up in something that's really more about Derek's vision for the neighborhood than any actual problems with how you maintain your property." "But you're still going along with it," I pointed out. "You're still part of the enforcement committee that's going to be harassing us and other families." "I'm trying to work within the system to keep things reasonable. If I step down from the committee, Derek will have even more influence over how these assessments are conducted." I could hear the strain in Patricia's voice, and I realized she was caught in a difficult position too. But that didn't make me feel much better about having my property scrutinized by someone who clearly had it out for us. "So, what happens after this assessment?" Sarah asked. "If Derek finds violations, then what? Formal notices, fines, and if violations aren't corrected within the specified time frame, the board can take legal action." "Legal action?" I repeated. "Over what, Patricia? Over my son playing football in our front yard?" "It wouldn't be just about that. They'd be looking for any violations of the HOA covenants. Improperly stored items, maintenance issues, unauthorized modifications, landscaping problems." Sarah was getting more upset. "This is our home, Patricia. We're not running a business or causing problems for anyone. We're just living our lives." "I understand, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the assessment is fair and reasonable. But I wanted you to know what was coming so you could prepare." I felt trapped between anger and resignation. Prepare how? By hiding who we are? By making sure our house looks like a museum instead of a home where people actually live? Maybe just make sure everything is as tidy as possible when they come. Put away any items that might be considered improperly stored. Make sure the lawn is freshly cut, that kind of thing. The fact that Patricia was giving us tips on how to pass inspection made the whole situation feel even more surreal and wrong. "Patricia," Sarah said, "I have to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Okay. If Derek wasn't pushing this initiative, and if the board wasn't feeling pressure to look tough on enforcement, would you personally think our behavior was bringing down property values?" The silence stretched so long that I started to wonder if Patricia had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, I wouldn't. And there's something else about Derek that you both need to know before next week." My heart started pounding harder. The way Patricia said that last sentence, with such gravity and reluctance, made me realize we were about to learn something significant about Derek's motivations. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the tension creeping into her voice, too. Patricia took a deep breath that was audible through the phone. "Derek has been pushing the board to increase our enforcement activities because he's planning to sell his house. He wants to move closer to his daughter's family in Phoenix, but he's convinced that property values in our neighborhood have been declining. the pieces started clicking together in my mind. So, this isn't really about maintaining community standards at all? Not entirely, no. Derek bought his house in 2007, right before the market crashed. He's never recovered the equity he lost, and now he's getting desperate. He thinks that if the HOA can demonstrate strict enforcement and community pride, it will help boost property values before he lists his house this spring. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could picture her processing this information the same way I was. The whole situation suddenly felt even more manipulative and unfair. So he's using the HOA as his personal real estate enhancement tool? I said. And families like ours are collateral damage in his plan to squeeze every possible dollar out of his sale. I'm afraid that's exactly what's happening. And because he's been on the board for 8 years and has a reputation for being thorough and detail-oriented, the other board members tend to follow his lead on enforcement matters. The kitchen suddenly felt too small and confining. I walked over to the sliding glass door that led to our back deck and stared out at our yard, where Jake's soccer ball sat in the grass next to the garden hose I'd left coiled by the tomato plants. Such ordinary, innocent signs of a family living their life, and somehow they'd become ammunition in Derek's campaign to perfect his neighborhood for sale. Patricia, this assessment next week, how detailed is it going to be? Sarah asked. Are we talking about a quick walk-by, or is Derek planning to document every blade of grass that's out of place? He's asked the committee to conduct what he calls a comprehensive property evaluation. That means photos, written documentation of any potential violations, and detailed notes about the overall condition and maintenance of each property. I turned back from the window, feeling a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. Photos? He's going to photograph our house like it's evidence in a crime scene? The assessment protocol calls for documentation. Yes, Derek has prepared forms for the committee to use, with checkboxes for different types of violations and space for detailed notes. Sarah stood up from the kitchen table and started pacing, something she always did when she was trying to work through a problem. This is insane, Patricia. You realize that, right? We're talking about turning neighbors into investigators and homes into suspects. I know how it sounds, and I know how it feels. But Derek has convinced the board that this kind of systematic approach is necessary to protect everyone's investment in the neighborhood. Everyone except the people who actually have to live under this microscope, I said. The frustration was building in my chest, making it hard to keep my voice level. What about protecting our investment in having a home where we can actually live comfortably? Through the phone, I could hear Patricia moving around, probably pacing in her own kitchen the way Sarah was pacing in ours. I've tried to argue for a more moderate approach, but Derek has statistics and examples from other HOAs that have increased property values through strict enforcement. The board finds his arguments compelling. Sarah stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen counter, running her hand through her hair in the gesture I recognized as her trying to stay calm when she was actually furious. What kind of violations is he expecting to find? What exactly is he looking for when he comes around here with his camera and clipboard? Anything that could be interpreted as deviating from the community standards outlined in the HOA covenants. Toys left in front yards, garden hoses not properly stored, lawn furniture that doesn't meet the aesthetic guidelines, cars parked in driveways instead of garages, maintenance issues like peeling paint or worn deck staining. I looked around our kitchen and through the doorways to the living room and front hall, trying to see our home through Derek's critical eyes. Suddenly, everything looked potentially problematic. Jake's backpack by the front door, the stack of mail on the counter, the sneakers Sarah had kicked off by the back door after her run this morning. Most of those things aren't even visible from the street, I pointed out. How is Derek planning to assess interior maintenance or items that are inside our houses? The assessment is supposed to focus on exterior conditions and anything visible from public areas. But Derek has been pushing for the right to request interior inspections if exterior conditions suggest potential problems. Interior inspections? Sarah's voice went up an octave. He wants the right to come inside our houses? It's not approved yet, and I'm fighting it. But Derek's argument is that things like water damage, pest problems, or structural issues that aren't properly maintained can affect neighboring properties and overall community values. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what Derek was trying to implement. Patricia, you realize this goes way beyond normal HOA oversight, right? This is starting to sound like he wants to run the neighborhood like some kind of authoritarian state. I know, and there's one more thing you need to know about next week's assessment. The way she said it made my stomach clench with anticipation of more bad news. Derek has specifically requested that your property be used as one of the test cases for the new evaluation protocol. Sarah's face went completely white. He specifically requested our house? Patricia nodded grimly. He said your property would be ideal as a baseline example because of what he called multiple observable compliance issues that he's documented over the past few months. I felt my anger flare again, but this time it was mixed with something else, a cold dread that made my hands shake slightly. What compliance issues? Patricia, I need you to tell me exactly what Derek has been saying about our property. He has photographs, Marcus. He showed them to the board last week. Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages. He sent me copies of his documentation after the meeting. I probably shouldn't show you these, but you need to know what you're dealing with. She turned her phone toward us, and I leaned in next to Sarah to look at the screen. The first image showed our front yard from the sidewalk. It looked completely normal to me. Green grass, the small flower bed Sarah had planted last spring, Jake's bicycle leaning against the garage door. I don't see any problems, Sarah said, echoing my thoughts. Patricia swiped to the next photo. According to Derek's notes, the bicycle placement violates Section 4.2 of the covenants regarding recreational equipment storage. It should be inside the garage or behind a fence where it's not visible from the street. It's a kid's bike leaning against our own garage, I said incredulously. How is that bringing down property values? There's more? She swiped again. This photo showed the side of our house where we kept our garbage cans. Derek documented that your trash receptacles were visible from the street on a non-collection day. According to his interpretation of the covenants, they should only be at the curb on collection morning and moved back immediately after pickup. Sarah grabbed my arm. Marcus, we put the cans out the night before pickup like everyone else does, and that photo is taken from an angle where you'd have to be standing in the Hendersons' driveway to even see them. Derek walked through everyone's property to get these documentation angles, Patricia admitted quietly. He says it's necessary for thorough compliance assessment. I stared at her. He's been trespassing on our property to take photos? Technically, he argues that he stayed on public easements and rights of way. But some of these angles? Patricia swiped to another photo showing our back deck from what looked like our neighbor's yard. I'm not sure how he got this shot without going onto private property. The photo showed our deck with Jake's soccer cleats on the steps and a towel draped over the railing. Everything looked normal and lived in to me, but Derek had annotated the image with arrows pointing to what he considered violations. What does he think is wrong with this picture? Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she almost didn't want to know. Patricia read from the notes on her phone. Personal items left on outdoor surfaces create visual clutter that detracts from neighborhood aesthetic standards. Sports equipment should be stored in designated areas. Textiles should not be used as temporary outdoor decoration. It's a towel, I said flatly. Jake used it after swimming and left it on the deck to dry. And those are his cleats that he took off before coming inside because I don't want mud tracked through the house, Sarah added. We're talking about normal family life, Patricia. How is any of this a legitimate HOA concern? Patricia looked miserable. Derek's argument to the board is that individual instances might seem minor, but collectively, they represent a pattern of disregard for community standards. He's using your property as an example of how small violations can accumulate to create an overall impression of declining neighborhood maintenance. An impression to who? I demanded. Who exactly is looking at our house and seeing declining property values because my son's bike is visible in our own driveway? That's what I keep asking Derek, but he has statistics from other communities where strict enforcement led to measurable increases in home sale prices. He's convinced the board that being proactive about these issues will protect everyone's investment. Sarah walked to the kitchen window and looked out at our backyard. When she turned back to us, her expression was a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like defeat. So, what happens during this assessment next week? Derek comes through with his camera and clipboard and documents every toy, every piece of outdoor furniture, every normal sign that a family actually lives here? The assessment is supposed to be conducted by a neutral third party, but Derek has volunteered to accompany them as a community liaison since he's already familiar with the properties and potential issues. Of course he has, I muttered. Patricia put her phone away and looked directly at both of us. Marcus, Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. Have you two had any personal conflicts with Derek? Anything that might explain why he's focusing so specifically on your property? I thought about the brief interactions I'd had with Derek over the months since he'd moved in. Most of them had been perfectly polite, if a little stiff. He'd introduced himself when he first moved to the neighborhood, had made a few comments about property maintenance when we'd run into each other at the mailbox, had mentioned his HOA involvement a few times. Nothing significant, I said finally. He's made a few comments about neighborhood standards, but I didn't think much of it at the time. What kind of comments? Patricia pressed. I tried to remember the specific conversations. Things like how important it was for everyone to maintain their properties properly. How one neglected house could affect everyone else's values. He mentioned a few times that he'd been on HOA boards before and knew how to keep communities looking their best. Sarah turned from the window. He did make that comment about Jake's bike the first week he moved in. Remember, Marcus? He suggested we might want to consider a bike storage solution that would be less visible from the street. I remember that, I said. But it seemed like a casual suggestion, not a threat. Maybe to you it was casual, Patricia said carefully. But Derek might have interpreted your not taking action on his suggestions as a sign that you weren't concerned about community standards. The implications of what she was saying hit me. Are you telling me that Derek has been building some kind of case against us because we didn't immediately reorganize our property based on his unsolicited suggestions? I'm telling you that Derek takes community standards very seriously, and he notices when people don't respond to what he considers helpful guidance. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Helpful guidance? That's what we're calling it when someone moves into a neighborhood and immediately starts telling established residents how to arrange their own property? The kitchen fell quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear Jake upstairs in his room, probably doing homework or playing games, completely unaware that our neighbor was building a case against our family based on photographs of his bicycle and soccer cleats. Patricia, I said finally, what exactly happens if Derek's assessment next week finds violations? What are the potential consequences? She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know before she even answered. The new enforcement protocol Derek proposed includes escalating penalties. First violations get warning notices. Second violations get fines starting at $250 per issue. Third violations can trigger forced compliance measures. Forced compliance measures? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Legal action to compel property modifications. In extreme cases, the HOA can place liens on properties for non-compliance. I felt the room spin slightly. Liens? Over a bicycle in a driveway? Over patterns of non-compliance that the board determines are detrimental to community property values. Sarah sank into the chair next to me. This is insane, Patricia. You realize this is completely insane, right? I know it sounds extreme, but Derek has legal precedent from other communities. He's researched this extensively. I looked at my wife, saw the same mixture of anger and fear in her eyes that I was feeling, and realized that everything about our life in this neighborhood was about to change. The assessment next week wasn't just an evaluation, it was the first move in what Derek clearly intended as a systematic campaign against our family. And based on Patricia's expression, I had the sinking feeling that Derek was just getting started. The silence stretched between us, thick with implications. Patricia's fingers drummed against her coffee mug, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our previous HOA meetings, but never understood the significance of until now. "There's something else," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Derek has been documenting what he calls compliance patterns throughout the neighborhood. Your family isn't the only one he's been photographing." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "He's created a spreadsheet, color-coded, green for properties that meet his standards, yellow for those with minor issues, red for what he considers chronic problems." Patricia's eyes met mine. "Your address has been red for 3 weeks." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around us. Through the window, I could see Derek's house, its perfect lawn, and precisely trimmed hedges now taking on a more sinister appearance. How many times had he stood at that window, camera in hand, waiting for Jake to leave his bike outside, or for one of us to commit some other supposed infraction? "Patricia," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Why are you telling us this? You could have just shown up next week with Derek and conducted your assessment." She set down her coffee mug with shaking hands. "Because I've been on this HOA board for 8 years. I've seen what happens when enforcement becomes the primary focus instead of community building. I've seen neighbors turn against each other over mailbox heights and flower color choices. I've watched children afraid to play in their own yards because someone might complain about noise levels." Sarah reached across the table and touched Patricia's arm. "This isn't what you signed up for when you joined the board." "No, it isn't." Patricia's voice cracked slightly. "When Derek presented his enforcement protocol to the board, he made it sound reasonable, professional. He had charts and graphs showing property value correlations in other communities. He made those of us who questioned his methods feel like we were being negligent in our duties." The weight of what we were facing began to settle fully in my chest. This wasn't just about our family anymore. Derek had systematically positioned himself to reshape the entire neighborhood according to his vision, and he'd convinced the HOA board that failure to comply with his standards was tantamount to destroying everyone's investment. "What happens if we don't comply with whatever violations he finds next week?" I asked. Patricia looked down at her hands. "The new protocol gives property owners 30 days to address violations after the first notice. If Derek determines the response is inadequate, the fines begin immediately. And based on his documentation system, your family would likely face multiple simultaneous violations." Sarah stood up abruptly, walking to the kitchen window. "He's out there right now," she said quietly. "In his front yard? Probably wondering why the HOA board president is having coffee in the house of his problem neighbors." I joined Sarah at the window. Derek was indeed in his front yard, ostensibly checking his mailbox, but his attention was clearly focused on our house. Even from this distance, I could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward our kitchen window. "He knows you're here," I said to Patricia. "Yes, and he'll ask me about it later." Patricia joined us at the window. "Derek has made it clear that board members should maintain appropriate boundaries with residents who are under review for violations." The three of us stood there, looking out at the man who had appointed himself as the arbiter of our neighborhood's standards. In that moment, I realized that this conflict was about much more than property maintenance or community guidelines. It was about power, control, and the kind of environment we wanted our son to grow up in. "Patricia," I said, turning away from the window, "what would happen if someone challenged Derek's assessment? What if we disagreed with his findings?" "The appeals process requires a formal hearing before the full board. You'd need to present evidence that his documentation was inaccurate or that the violations don't actually exist." She paused. "But Derek has been very thorough in his documentation. Timestamps, multiple angles, detailed descriptions." Sarah returned to the table, her expression thoughtful. "What if his documentation shows things that aren't actually violations according to the original HOA guidelines?" Patricia looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Derek has been so focused on his own interpretation of community standards that he's documenting things that aren't actually against any written rules?" The question hung in the air between us. Patricia's expression slowly changed as the implications became clear. "When was the last time anyone actually reviewed the original HOA covenant?" Sarah continued. "Not Derek's new protocols, but the actual governing documents that we all agreed to when we bought our houses?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think anyone has looked at the original documents since Derek joined the board. His research was so comprehensive, his presentations so professional. We assumed he'd based his recommendations on existing guidelines." I felt something shift in my chest, the first hint of hope I'd experienced since this whole situation began. "Patricia, do you have access to the original HOA documents?" "Of course. They're on file with the county, and every board member has copies." Sarah and I exchanged glances. "Would you be willing to bring them by tomorrow? I think it's time we all understood exactly what rules we actually agreed to follow." Patricia nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression showed something other than resignation or fear. "Yes, I think that's exactly what we need to do." As she gathered her things to leave, Derek was still in his front yard, now making a show of examining his garden borders while keeping our house in his peripheral vision. The man who had seemed so formidable an hour ago now looked somehow smaller, less certain. Tomorrow, we would find out whether Derek's campaign against our family was built on actual community standards or simply on his own interpretation of how a neighborhood should look. And for the first time since this conflict began, I had the feeling that the answer might not be what Derek expected.